My name's Gifford. Since 2022, I've been fighting alongside Ukraine against Russia as a volunteer. And this is everything I'm authorized to tell you. The Russian war machine is incredibly efficient, incredibly big, and incredibly dangerous. So for them, it's a war of annihilation. And the people you're fighting against are incredibly dangerous, oftentimes fanatical or desperate people that would torture you and kill you if they caught you. So there was an agreement, no one in the unit was allowed to be taken alive. Tens of thousands of volunteers from all around the world went out to Ukraine, most to fight, but many more also went to act as humanitarians. I reached out to some friends of mine who were going to join a unit called the 131st, which was a battalion in the Ukrainian army. And it was only in really actually September, I suppose you could say, of 2022 that I joined the Ukrainian army for the first time. In the south with the 131st, in the first two stages of the three stages of my war, I was under the Southern Command. Ukraine is split into various commands in the north, east and south. The front line is vast. There are hundreds of thousands of soldiers. When we fought on the front line, we deployed as a unit of between 5 and 10, and we were all international volunteers. Ukraine, in many ways, is a war of innovation. Adaptability really is what could win or lose the war. The Ukrainians have had to expand their capabilities to meet this massive threat that they've faced. The most obvious place that is making the news in the West on a daily basis now is the utilization of drones, particularly commercial drones as well. In the early days of the war, it was DJI, a very popular Chinese brand, was utilized by both sides to act as a reconnaissance vehicle to locate Russian units. As time progressed, so did the innovation, and the commercial drones suddenly began dropping munitions. The munitions themselves evolved from being able to kill and wound a single soldier to suddenly blowing up a tank. And suddenly that drone that's worth just $2,000 is suddenly blowing up a tank worth $1 million. And then that becomes even more magnified with the utilization of FPV, first-person drones, or first-person view drones. These FPVs are commercially obtained. They utilize radio waves to between the controller and the drone itself, with a munition on it, which can be impact detonated or electronically detonated to strike a vehicle or a bunker or a set of people. Now, the Ukrainians really pioneered that, but because of the support that China gives to Russia, the Russians have been able to build and have been able to scale up their drone provision even more and much more rapidly than the Ukrainians. I think in more recent months, things have started to equalize a little bit, but there was a period just before I set up our own FPV team where I noticed that the Russians suddenly had the upper hand in the drone war in the south. We were struggling to move. Even drones themselves, these FPV drones have changed. My friends have been fighting in Kursk, and the drones that have been pioneered since that battle started have been fiber optic drones. And these fiber optic drones are unhackable, quite essentially, because the way that the Russians and the Ukrainians have countered the FPV drone, traditionally with the radio waves, is to actually introduce anti-drone technology that can bring these things down. And there were missions that I went on where we would lose 3-4 drones going after key assets. I have one in my mind right now where we were on a mission and we saw this, I think it was a T-90 or something, a T-90 tank, and we launched a drone at it and it flopped out of the sky. What happened? No idea. It could have been chance. Send another one. We sent up another one and it flopped out of the sky. We launched a third drone and sure enough, within 50 meters, it flops out of the sky and lands near them. So clearly that had an anti-drone technology on board and it was stopping us from hitting it. The utilization of these fiber optic cables is changed everything, because that drone will hit you. If it spots you and it's got a good pilot, you will die. And if you don't have anti-drone technology, the proliferation of drones means that the amount of casualties in the front line now is absolutely atrocious. In the first few months of my time in the 131st, we began a very rigorous series of missions. And those missions were confined mostly to the fields outside of a city called Kherson. Now, Kherson is a vast city in the south of Ukraine. It had been taken by the Russians very early on in the war, and the Ukrainians were determined to get it back. And they had a good chance because Kherson is on one side of the vast Dnipro River, and all the supplies getting to Kherson and to the front line were all having to come across this river. And with the introduction of American-made HIMARS and other weaponry, suddenly these landing points became a target for the Ukrainians. So the Russians in our area were very weak. And the Ukrainians were pushing incredibly hard. The early missions that I did were actually just intelligence gathering. So we would push out in patrols all along the zero line, just literally skirting the very edge of the Ukrainian positions, looking for minefields, speaking to local Ukrainian units, asking them what they've heard, what they've seen. And we did that for weeks and weeks and weeks prior to the final push towards Kherson, which liberated the city. There was one particular mission that we were deposited in a wood. We walked through it. We finally found this sort of Ukrainian position was at the very forefront of the Ukrainian army. There was nothing but no man's land in front of them, which also happened to be a long tree line leading towards a distant tree line about 900 meters forward. The Ukrainians were spooked. They'd been there for a few days, but they'd heard a lot of movement ahead of them, and they were worried that their small platoon of sort of 8 to 10 people wouldn't be able to hold the tree line if they were attacked. They asked us to go down as a patrol and to see what we could find. We were so close we could hear them cutting wood. We could hear a generator going. We could even hear them laughing. When someone shouted at someone else or laughed really loudly, their voice carried to us really easily. And that would have been an opportunity to pull back. But in the end, what we did discover at the end of the tree line were a number of trenches, which we then quickly cleared. There wasn't anyone in those particular trenches, but we did seize sort of radios, we seized weapons, a number of other items. It was clearly a place that they used to do guard duty. As we were robbing their trench, about sort of 25 meters away in another dugout, a Russian sort of spots one of our guys jumping in one of the trenches or moving between the trees and opens up with an automatic grenade launcher. And soon enough, our entire tree line was being absolutely obliterated by PKMs, AK-47s. Thankfully, as the bullets cracked around us, we were able to crawl out of that situation and get back to the Ukrainians, and we were able to report to them, yeah, there are definitely Russians down there. And we carried on. We kept on pushing down the tree line, and we met different units all the way along the front line for miles and miles and miles. And it's just a constant fear and a constant level of activity. From the moment you get up in the morning, you get into that armoured vehicle to get to the front line, to the moment you leave, your life is constantly in danger. On that one day, I nearly died about 1,000 times. But after the liberation of Kherson city, which, by the way, was one of the most defining moments of my time in Ukraine, sort of patrolling through those villages and seeing Ukrainian civilians coming out crying, I genuinely saw so many grateful people coming out of their homes after months and months of torturous Russian occupation. And it was a sense of fulfillment, of a realization that I'm doing exactly what I'm meant to be doing in Ukraine. That mission ended, the liberation was over, the city was free, and the new front line was the river, was where these islands were. That kicked off what I like to call the River War. So the 131st, it was fighting on the river in Kherson. The fight was terrible. There were a vast number of islands in the sort of Dnipro Delta. All these little islands became battlegrounds for reconnaissance units. And the 131st was perfectly placed, deploying in 5-man teams, pushing forward, taking ground. In 2023, something changed. And that was the Chinese began providing the Russians with a vast number of drones, FPV drones, DJI quadcopters capable of dropping munitions on people's heads. It became so dangerous on those islands that you couldn't even move without being spotted by the Russians. And the moment you're spotted, all hell breaks loose. There's mortars going off, there's shell fire, there's drones coming after you. And it's a terrifying environment to be in. But we would land on these islands, And then you'd hear that horrible hovering sound, the whirring sound of a drone, and then within seconds, you're still getting your kit out of the boat, and then bang! Like the earth-shattering roar of a mortar or a tank shell, and they come in fast. And as you're walking to your position, there are buildings around you blowing up. But you'd get to your position, hold the position for a while, for a few days. Sometimes you were replacing somebody. Sometimes the Russians wouldn't know exactly where you were. They later had a policy of actually just destroying everything. So if you're in a village, they would try and burn the whole village down just because they know you were there. They had a tactic of just sending drones over, dropping flammable munitions on top of the houses just to smoke us out. And that happened a few times. And then the drone would then watch. And as soon as it sees people running out of the burning houses, they'd then call in artillery. So we would dig into the basements. We'd rip up the floorboards, dig into the basements. We'd find forested areas, dig into the ground. And it was 1 week on, 1 week off. And we needed that because the tension is so horrendous. You're constantly on edge. You're sleeping underground most of the time, or if you can't be underground, you're inside a house, and there's constant shell fire. And it's just awful to wake up at 1 o'clock in the morning and suddenly, bang, the house is on top of you. You're buried in the house. And that happened a few times to us. There's no safety at all. You're hiding in a house and you hear the drones buzzing around the house. And it's 24/7. It's in the middle of the day. It's in the middle of the night. They fly around the house looking through the windows. You can try and shoot them down, but if you do that, there's a danger. The drone can't hear you, but observation groups might do. So if they say, oh, we can hear there's gunfire, and then sometimes good drone pilots can tell that they're being shot at, so it'll then fly away and then call an airstrike on that area, or they'll start shelling that area. If they spot you, they'll also airstrike you. So the drone won't necessarily kill you, but it will lead to your death if it spots you. One thing that gives me comfort, and people mocked me for in my battalion and in my unit, was I was obsessed by bunkers and being underground. So every time we moved positions, I would walk. The first thing I said as I walked into a house, is there a bunker? Is there a cellar? Is there somewhere for me to go? And the first thing I'd do was check it out. I'd jump in there. If there's a hole to jump in, I was always in it. And people would tease me for that, since I was like a rat. I'd become almost rodent-like in my how I operated. And what I mean by that is you spent most of your time either in a cellar or trying to take cover from mortars or drones and that sort of stuff. When you emerge into the light, your whiskers are flickering, your nose is twitching, you're looking nervously from side to side, and any hint of trouble, you're running for safety. It kept me alive. It's kept me alive over the years, and it kept me alive in Ukraine. There's one particular incident where we were able to take personal effects from the Russians, and that was on the islands, when we pushed forwards to a house. Thankfully, the Russians had pulled back to another position just a few hundred yards away. But as we cleared that building, going through the different rooms, the Russians had left just a few hours before and had left everything behind, from their body armor to some of their weapons, but also their personal effects. I read letters in Russian to their sweethearts at home, to their wives, diaries and other things. As per usual, we gleaned everything for information, packed it into bags and sent it back to be processed, and took war trophies. In fact, two of the patches from that particular incident, this patch here and this patch, were from that house. I understand this is the hometown of where these Russian soldiers came from. My unit was actually stood down from a tempo of one mission a week, 1 week on, 1 week off, to suddenly not doing a mission in 3 weeks because of the danger of the islands. And it was that reason that I said to myself, there's a need here for our own FPVs, our own drones. So it was just an incredibly challenging environment, but we made it work. And the proof is in the pudding. Most of the islands in the Dnieper are free, and it's because of those efforts. The Russian war machine, it has many strengths and many weaknesses. Its strengths are the sheer size and the volume of the military forces it's able to put into the field. Firstly, its professional army, but also the fact that it's got a vast conscript pool, which on top of that was a vast amount of Soviet weaponry inherited from the USSR. It's also partnering very closely with China and with North Korea and Iran, sharing technology, sharing money, sharing resources for their own mutual benefit. The Russians have adapted to the fact that they aren't as strong as they thought they were. They thought the war would be over in 3 days. In the early days of the war, they sent their creme de la creme of the Russian armed forces to Ukraine, and they died in their thousands in vast convoys, either just north of Kyiv or in the east and south on the way to Kherson. They had to adapt by recruiting thousands more. They had to recruit people from abroad. They had to adapt their actual assaults, their ability to fight on the front line. They could no longer do combined arms warfare because of the lack of trained soldiers. And instead, they started the human meat wave assaults because that's all they're good for. And also just the level of despair for the Russian soldiers on the ground. I saw there was cases of Russian soldiers piling up dead bodies, essentially, literally piles of bodies. And people just being forced to do the most dreadful things by their own commanders, digging in the open. There was one position that, I don't know whose idea it was on the Russian side, they were digging a trench directly towards the Ukrainians in the hope that obviously they had tried going over the ground and running over the field, but they weren't making it, so they decided to just dig and go through the thing. But the trouble is there's still no cover. There's no tree lines. There's no branches of trees to stop the drones from hitting you. You've got a shovel in your hand. You're exhausting yourself trying to dig through that cold, hard earth, only to have an FPV after 5 hours of labour crash into you, and then you've got to then crawl back with either no legs or one leg back to a Russian position, which the vast majority of the time, their ability to treat their casualties effectively is really bad. It's terrible, in fact. We'd see bodies and also capture positions where we'd look at their IFAK kits, we'd look at their medical supplies, and they were utilising ropes as tourniquets. They had this strange sort of 1980s sort of rubber band thing that they would tie around their legs. There was reports that they were bringing tampons to the front line, and they were being told to insert commercially bought tampons into their bullet wounds to stop the blood loss, which is ridiculous. It's just not going to treat you effectively. So Russia has gone to every depth of depravity you could possibly imagine in Ukraine. There's famous memes online of Russians running off with everything from toilets that they've looted to washing machines and refrigerators. And more than that, the Russians have obviously bombed entire cities to the ground, everything from Bakhmut to Mariupol. The targeting of civilians, hospitals, including hospitals that cater for children. And it makes you wonder, like, what are their tactics? What is the end goal of that? Is it worth fighting on if there's nothing left to inherit at the end of all of this? Broadly speaking, I would prefer to use a British military uniform, primarily for quality reasons more than anything else, and comfort. Also, I had a quite slim body armour, predominantly because of the fact that we were a reconnaissance unit. We had to squeeze through gaps in buildings. We had to run between thorn bushes and tree lines and all the rest of it. So I tried to keep my personal kit as close to my body as possible. I had a battle belt with magazines on. I only had a couple of magazines on my plate carrier, a couple of grenades. I did often have an assault pack, which I would go and fight with. My personal weapon initially was a AK-74, which was the standard issue for the 131st in the first month of my time with them. That would change to the Polish Grot, which is a sort of a NATO standard weapon. I customized it with a foregrip and red dot with a magnifier. I obviously had Russian or sort of former Soviet grenades mostly. The prized ones for the Ukrainians were the American and British ones, but the ones I always had were the Russian ones. In regards to sort of a secondary weapon for me personally was a grenade launcher, 40mm American-made single-shot grenade launcher. We sometimes would bring an RPG, a rocket-propelled grenade, which was a sort of former Soviet design, to the islands to hit buildings on the islands sometimes. But in regards to actually anti-tank, it was always NATO that would provide the best kits. NLAWs, Javelin, Mantador, I think it was Spanish made. We'd also have drones as well that we'd bring with us. Those were reconnaissance drones predominantly. But when we became an FPV team, when we actually set up a drone team, we actually did deploy always with FPV related kit, and that was always sort of batteries and controllers and signals equipment, also a number of drones to actually utilize the munitions themselves, the batteries. The vast majority of the time we are light infantry. Obviously a knife as well, a knife constantly on my plate carrier. That's a habit I've always had since Syria, and a realization that you're going into an environment where you have to be self-sufficient, so enough food and water for however long you're going out for. Functionary and half-decent equipment was very common on the front line in Ukraine. But if you wanted the really decent thermal scope, if you wanted the very best drone that could be bought commercially, then oftentimes it is up to the military themselves or international volunteers to fundraise for that kit. I began doing things like buying drones for the units. I began buying anti-drone software and hardware to go on their vehicles. I also purchased and delivered vehicles to the battalion as well. And the best way to do that, to get the financing together, is not to rely on the Ukrainians to navigate the bureaucracy of the system, but instead go directly to my followers on social media. I suppose the third phase of my time in Ukraine, personally, was the shift from the south, from Kherson, to the east, to a place called Lyman. It was the summer of 2023, and the Ukrainians were on the march. The Russians were desperate to stop them, and they were counterattacking. With us being in the south, a reconnaissance group that now specialized in drones, our help was needed. Suddenly we're fighting these waves of Russians coming in tank columns. And then we also saw the terrible casualties that the Russians were getting. But again, it was strangely distant, yet also intimate, because there's something very strange about loading up your car with FPV drones and reconnaissance drones, driving to the front line, but not going to the very, very front line, maybe coming a mile off the zero line, and then sending drones over, and you're targeting people, you're trying to blow them up. You can see them running around. For several more months, I was in the cold, snowy ground of eastern Ukraine with the drone team, doing my best to support them in getting as many drones to the front line as possible, and as many Russians sent home as possible as well. I was there as a protection team for the drone units, but also as a driver as well to get them in, also as the designated medic to try and help them if they got injured. We'd set up laptops in these bunkers, would have big batteries for the power source, and we'd put up a little cable, sometimes tie it to a tree for the signals. And then we became observers, like sort of ghosts over the battlefield, either looking for targets or just keeping a constant eye. And again, the most abiding memory is just the fact that the number of kills increased rapidly from our time in the south. There was a lot more vehicles being destroyed. My time in Ukraine can be separated in different phases. My first phase was the pre-war phase, which was in February of 2022. When just a few weeks before the war started. The next phase was my time coming back to Ukraine as a humanitarian, training people in battlefield medicine. That was in sort of March to about sort of June time in 2022. The process of becoming an international volunteer is actually remarkably easy. Particularly in relation to Ukraine. Before the war, you could fly directly to Lviv on Ryanair. With the outbreak of the war, with the fact that the Russians were threatening to shoot down any aircraft in Ukraine airspace, the only way to get in was via the land border. And I drove across the border, and it was incredibly surreal to see the queues of people vast queues, so long, in fact, that some people were abandoning their cars in the queue and just simply walking to the border. And the road into Kyiv and into Ukraine was completely empty. And that's the tried and tested route for most international volunteers who went to Ukraine. Most of them would go on to sign up in a place called Lviv. They'd join the army and they'd be sent off to camps. Very soon after my arrival, while I was on the ground in places like Kyiv, Lviv, Odessa, I was hearing reports of the terrible war crimes in places like Bucha and Irpin, of civilians being shot in the streets. And there I was on the ground, looking Ukrainians in the eye, meeting them, getting to know them as people. And then when I heard about the war crimes, I realized that the battlefield aid, the charitable work, was only tinkering on the edges. I knew and I felt the same sort of passion and the determination to stand alongside the Ukrainians that I felt when I went out to join the Kurds against the Islamic State. If I wanted to make a stand against Russia, if I wanted to really stand alongside the Ukrainians, I had to join the army. So that's exactly what I did. Looking in those early days, the international volunteers may have looked like a drag on the system because it was all hands to the pump in Ukraine. Everyone was trying to survive. Hundreds of thousands of people were turning up at recruitment centres. There was no capability for the Ukrainians to actually train their own people, let alone thousands of foreigners. But I don't see it that way. I see it that this was a burst of energy, human energy, goodwill, passion from the international community, including individual citizens going out to support Ukraine. As far as I'm concerned, you're not a hero just for turning up. You're a hero for what you do. And many people went and left, but a few stayed, learnt the language, learnt the culture, ingratiated themselves with the Ukrainians, and delivered capabilities to the Ukrainians early on that were actually really useful. I'm talking about things like battlefield medicine, the utilization of some of the weapons that were coming in from the West at the time. They were already familiar. Many of the former service people that joined were already familiar with these weapon systems. So I see them as a band of brothers who went out to support Ukraine in its hour of need, with a few crazy ones mixed in. There are many ways to categorize the international volunteers, and they came to do different things. Some joined the army, some came as simple volunteers. You also saw people with no military experience coming out to join the army. These are the sort of passionate ones, the ones that sort of heard Zelenskyy's call early doors, and they were sort of politically and ideologically motivated. I can't criticize these people because I'm one of those people. I didn't have any sort of conventional military experience when I went out to join the Kurds so many years ago. Many, quite frankly, shouldn't have been there at all. They might have been fleeing something in their home country, whether that's drink or drug abuse. They might see Ukraine as a place to prove themselves, I suppose, to gain some sort of respect from the people around them. There have been far worse people. And there was the terrible case of Dan Burke and several actually other gentlemen that were murdered by other international volunteers. So frankly, some very dangerous people have turned up as well. But they are far and few between. They often don't have the capacity to stay in Ukraine for the long term. But either way, all kinds of people did turn up in those early days, and it would take months and months for the Ukrainians to sort through them, find the gems, and deploy them effectively on the front line. The training that was given to the volunteers in those early days was very poor, and the organisation was very poor too. And there were some very early mistakes. One of the most noticeable and well known was a terrible attack on a base very close to Lviv that was housing international volunteers. Dozens of people were killed and injured in that attack because foreigners were tweeting, were using their mobile phones in a war zone, perhaps not, obviously naively, and the Russians were able to find the location of this base and strike it with long-range cruise missiles. Things would later change, whereby the international volunteers then became more organised. So after learning about the creation of the international volunteers, the international brigades in Ukraine, and knowing that it was going to have some teething problems, I deliberately kept away. So I joined directly with the Ukrainian army and signed my contract with the Ministry of Defence and not with the International Legion, primarily just because I wanted to stay away from foreigners and work directly with Ukrainians. I had a medical test and a fitness test that I had to go through. Once I had been cleared for service by the MOD in Ukraine, I was then liable to be taken by any Ukrainian unit that wished to have me. Now, the international volunteers that I was with were determined to get to the 131st. And the 131st, as I said, was an elite regiment, a great regiment to get into. I was actually, of my little group, I had the least experience in terms of conventional military experience. But what appealed to me about the reconnaissance group that was fighting in the south, the 131st, was because it was light infantry. A lot of the work that they were doing was very similar to the work that I did with the YPG and SDF in Syria. Now, the SDF operated in things called tabors, which were about 40-man teams. And a tabor would ride around in soft-skin vehicles with no heavy weapons, just AK-47s with body armor, grenades. They would clear buildings, they would push through villages, through mountain ranges, you name it, we had to clear it all. And a lot of those experiences in Syria, fighting in Raqqa, in places like Manbij and Tilhamas, it all lent itself to the work that I would later do for the Ukrainian military. We were a very aggressive unit. If we were told to do something, we were going to do it. Well, no matter the casualties, no matter how difficult it was, the risks involved, you just put your head down and just do it. As long as our radio guy could speak Ukrainian and our point man can speak Ukrainian, then we could actually operate very effectively. We had to be adaptable. We had to be able to protect ourselves, and the weapons that we chose to bring with us, from grenade launchers to anti-tank missiles to the heavy machine guns, the PKMs that we brought with us, all helped us become very self-reliant. There's a common misconception that international volunteers in Ukraine are mercenaries. Now, as far as I'm concerned, that's simply not true. A mercenary, by definition, is a soldier, a trained soldier that sells his service for money. Now, international volunteers from Britain, America, France, etc., have all gone out to Ukraine to stand in solidarity with the local people. They get paid not a single penny more than any other Ukrainian does. We get the same benefits if we're injured, the same veteran benefits once we retire than any other soldier in Ukraine. The classic definition of a mercenary is the Wagner Group, which is the Russian mercenary group that fights in foreign countries, often destabilizing them and butchering and murdering and torturing local people, but also the thousands of people that have gone over to join the Russian army. Now, the Russian army is employing the most terrible tactics to encourage people, often from the sort of the third world, from developing countries where there is terrible poverty, to join them. And sometimes they're doing it through lies, saying that they've got a job in Moscow in a factory, but then they turn up, they're threatened with arrest or deportation, and suddenly they find themselves fighting in the Donbass. So as far as I'm concerned, we're just simply Ukrainian soldiers fighting alongside them. So there is a base salary, and that base salary is $500 a month. There is also a combat bonus, which brings your salary, your base salary, up to $2,000, or around $2,000 a month. Only a fool, as far as I'm concerned, would go to Ukraine looking for money. This is a good point, actually, to point out my two patches. This was the Vidmark group, or Vidmark, which is a local name. It means witcher, in fact, in Ukrainian. On the other side is my battalion insignia. And it's the traditional cross of Ukraine. The colors are red and black, and the logo, the motto, I should say, in Ukrainian, which is always forward. A lot of international volunteers collect patches. Just starting from the top, you've got the unit patch here, the 131st, here and here. These are my unit patches, the International Volunteer Unit of the 131st. And below that are things that I was given. Poroshenko, the former president of Ukraine, gifted me this patch. He also gave me this one. These are also unit patches from Ukrainian battalions that gifted them to me. And then next to that are sort of Syrian patches, I suppose you could say. This one of the YPG in Syria that fought against ISIS. Below that is Wagner Group, which is a patch taken from a dead Russian soldier. This one here and here are unit patches of the Russian military. I took these ones down in Kherson. So a lot of international volunteers will collect thousands of patches. Me, I only keep the ones that I earned or was given or I took from the enemy. My real name is Harry, but I go by Mesa Gifford. Mesa Gifford is a nom de guerre that I chose when I first went out to Syria way back in 2015. I did it because I went to fight against the Islamic State alongside the Kurdish people in that area, in the region. And obviously, the Islamic State were putting bounties on people's heads. They were, I was going to put a big bounty on my own head, particularly for the length of time that I fought there and the amount of political work I did out there. So it was very sensible to choose a name that was memorable, was something that the local people could pronounce, and something that was familiar to me. I like the name, so chose it. My journey from ordinary city worker, working in London with a girlfriend, with a partner and a flat in London, to suddenly fighting first in Syria and then obviously later in Ukraine and doing other things. It all began with the rise of the Islamic State, I suppose. Very early, way back in 2008, I went out to Zimbabwe to work for the MDC, the Movement for Democratic Change, against Robert Mugabe. And after a few years of work in the city, and then seeing the rise of what was going on in the Middle East with the region being torn apart, I suppose I started to remember what drove me when I was younger. First, the one abiding memory that I can remember writing about for my book about Syria was this moment on a train when I picked up a newspaper and there was the title like I think it was Brave in the Face of Pure Evil or something. And it was a picture of a aid worker just about to have his head cut off. And I could have just joined a charity. I could have, again, fiddled around the edges of the problem in Syria, just like the rest of the world was doing. But instead, what angered me was the images of the Yazidi girls being burnt alive in cages, of being sold in slave markets. And I realized that if you believe in internationalism, if you believe in humanism, if you want to actually deal with something that is dreadful happening on the other side of the world, you are not just a hopeless spectator. You have agency. You have the ability to say, no, I'm going to go out, I'm going to do something here, I'm going to draw attention to this issue, and I'm going to do the very least I can do, which, as far as I'm concerned, and this is the least I do, picking up a weapon, any fool can do. I have skirted, it is very controversial even from a legal perspective, but I've always abided by the law, the British law, and but it's something that I know is worthwhile and good. One of my biggest strengths has always been to use my privilege as a British person to articulate the cause that I'm supporting. The war zones that we go to and the causes we get involved with, they are toxic environments that play havoc on mental and emotional health. One of the ways that I've kept myself safe is the fact that I always have a plan. And that is I compartmentalize my time in the countries that I support. I'm going for a reason. There's always something that I'm doing. I am going to set up a medical program. I'm going to be doing certain advocacy work, whether it's writing articles or whether it's speaking in parliaments or meeting whoever, major players and decision makers in certain quarters. If I can do all of that and it's quantifiable, it could be written down and articulated, then again, it gives me purpose, it gives me focus. But if you don't have that mentality and you're just waiting to see what happens, or the grass is always greener, or you're running from something from home, your problems will catch up with you eventually. And in a war zone, and with the stresses that you're under as well, you're not going to find salvation. It's a very dark and difficult place. I've lost so many people that I've known over these more than a decade of fighting and working in various conflict zones. There was one incident in Raqqa when myself and two other guys crossed a road And there was a machine gun at the end of the road, an ISIS machine gun, and they shot left to right. I was the third guy on the end. And they shot and killed the first two guys. They actually shot me as well. They hit my body armor, and I was flung to the ground and I crawled off the road. But I survived. And as I said, it's pure chance whether or not you live or die sometimes. That's not always the case. There's a famous saying that I've never forgotten, which is, how do you get so lucky? The more I train, the luckier I get. It's kind of like that too. The more you experience of war, the more you experience of the terrible things that can happen to you, it helps you to survive. Oftentimes, I've seen a lot of guys die because they underestimated the enemy. They didn't know exactly what it was like to fight. And a lot of guys I met in Ukraine, a lot of them are former service people too, who had never. A lot of them hadn't fought in particularly difficult environments in the past, and they sort of came to the conflict zone thinking it was going to be the same, much of the same, and then they would die because they didn't take cover that time, because they thought, the Russians never do this, the Russians never do that, and then the one time the Russians do what you have always said that they weren't going to do is the day that you die. My time in Ukraine ended just before Christmas in 2023. My father was very unwell, and sadly, within a month of me returning home, passed away. And it gave me a new perspective on what I was doing in Ukraine. And largely, I'd completed much of what I wanted to achieve. I was still able to raise $100,000 for the Ukrainian military in that time. But I also started to remember that there were other causes as well that I wanted to support. In the news recently has been things like the conflict in Syria is hot topic. The Donald Trump presidency. There's a lot going on in the world, and I am not going to rush anywhere. I'm going to focus on myself, my family, come up with a clear plan, a clear goal, and I'm going to choose my next mission. So one of the things that's kept me sane since I left Ukraine has been my writing. It helped me so much when I left Syria all those years ago. I wrote a book called Fighting Evil, which came out in 2020. I did start writing a book, an account of my time in Ukraine. But actually, one thing I've always enjoyed and always been intrigued about is writing fiction. So one of the things I've been doing over the last few months is writing a fiction book about Ukraine and about the war against Russia. At the same time, I was able to come back with a huge amount of footage, just by the nature of this conflict, it being the most filmed war probably of all time. I think putting that together into a really compelling documentary, into something that will tell the story of the international volunteers, that will tell the story of Ukraine through the eyes of people who have gone out to support them, would be a really good thing. If I am to build a life after this, and whatever life that might be, it would be good to go back to my old name, which is just simply Harry. Harry from England.
Hi, I'm a producer and Authorized account. If you enjoyed this video, then please subscribe and comment with more topics that you'd like us to cover in this series.